Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It is Monday, March 2nd. Derek VanRiper on the road in Arizona. Eno Sarah's in camp as we speak, but we have 3 more team previews to get to today, so I have a lot of help from our great beat writers here at The Athletic. We have the Mets, the Guardians, and the Blue Jays all on tap. We're going to start today with the Mets, and joining me is Tim Britton, one of our fantastic beat writers covering the Mets. Tim, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So what we've been doing is we can look at every team's position player group, trying to find the key and obvious, like everyday 5 core players, because you can mix and match at 4 spots. Teams have 13 position player spots. And I think the Mets have more than 5 everyday players. At least they should with the resources that they have in place. So there's not a lot of debate about like who's really in their 5. It's more like on the bottom half of the roster, who plays the most. That's what I think a lot of our listeners are wondering about. So, you look at Soto, you look at Bo Bichette, you look at Lindor, obviously they're max volume everyday players. Marcus Semien, probably a max volume everyday player, health permitting. Jorge Polanco probably fits into that bucket too. But you get to the bottom half and you're like, okay, Brett Beatty, like what's his role look like this year? Mark Vientos, what does his role look like this year? So I'm just kind of curious as you look at different platooning options and you think about the defensive alignment of this team, which is taking some risks, I think, to put it mildly. Who do you see as sort of winning out on the bottom half of this roster with larger than expected roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think when they signed Bo Bichette to play third base, a lot of people were wondering, well, what does that mean for Brett Beatty, a guy who, had been a top prospect for them, had kind of floundered for a couple of years for finding his rhythm, especially, after May of last year, being really, I think he was their second best hitter by OPS after the All-Star break last season, looked like at least an average to maybe slightly above average third baseman, was able to hold his own at second base defensively when they had to put him there. So, where does the Bichette move? What does that leave for Beatty? And that's talked about. Well, he can still play a little bit of second when they need him. He can play some first. He can play maybe some outfield. We haven't seen him get outfield reps yet in spring training because he tweaked his hamstring a little bit before getting to camp. But we have seen him at first base already. And, the way they've talked about Polanco, they signed him to be a first baseman out of Seattle. But it's not to be the first baseman for 150 games. They've already talked about like DH is going to be a big part of his repertoire this year. Last year he played the majority of his games at DH. He started the majority of his games at DH for the Mariners. So I think Beatty probably gets a lot of play against right-handed pitchers, either at first base or at DH himself. I think between or among Beatty, Polanco, and Vientos, those are 3 guys who are going to occupy 2 spots in the lineup on a regular basis. Against righties, I'd expect it to be Polanco and Beatty. Against lefties, maybe Polanco and Vientos. But I think Beatty's the kind of guy who, with his versatility, maybe he gets to right field eventually, but, can fill in for Semien at second if something happens there, is the fill-in for Bichette at third if anything happens there. Could still be a guy who gets 400, 500 plate appearances, even if he doesn't have that set everyday role.
Yeah, the versatility does seem like it makes him a great fit because there could be injuries. There will be injuries inevitably over the course of the season. So I do like Beatty a lot for a nice, kind of like, big side platoon role, even though it might come at 2 or 3 different spots any given week. Thinking about the defense so far, what have the early reviews been? The first few Grapefruit League games throughout camp, does it look like it's going to work at the infield corners in particular? Obviously, Francisco Lindor has been down with the hamate. Not worried about him. Marcus Semien, good defender up the middle at second. But it's those chances they took by moving Bo to third and bringing Polanco in to at least be part of that first base rotation that I think people have the most questions about.
Yeah, we haven't seen enough of it. Really, at first base, we haven't seen Polanco play first base yet. Beatty just got there the other day. So that, really, whoever's playing first base is going to be relatively inexperienced there. Polanco has played there professionally for 1 pitch with the Mariners last year. Beatty hasn't played it since high school when he got there the other day. Vientos has played it a bit, but again, not the position he came up playing regularly throughout the minor leagues, not the position he played in 2024 when he saw a lot of regular time. So first base, that's going to be an issue. But, the bar was set pretty low last year by Pete Alonso, who had, a really subpar defensive season for himself. It was significantly worse than it had been previously. And so the Mets just believe, an average first baseman is an improvement over what they got last year at that position. At third with Bichette, there have been, I think the first ball hit to him in spring training, he threw a little bit up the line to first base. They didn't make the catch. That was on social media very quickly, and a lot of people wondering, well, this isn't going to work out. I think they believe that because of Bichette's, like his range at shortstop was not elite. It was toward the lower end of what you can get at shortstop. That can still play at third base. They think he's going to get the timing down at that position, and that his arm is good enough. I think that's another main concern people have is that arm strong enough to play third? The Mets initially thought of Bichette as a second baseman at the start of the offseason before they made the deal for Marcus Semien. But we've seen, it's looked fine so far. One slightly errant throw out the window, but that's definitely something we're going to watch all spring into the early season, because if that doesn't work, if Bichette at third doesn't work, then man, it becomes a lot tougher puzzle for them to make work defensively over the course of the season.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think part of their defensive improvement or potential defensive improvement is also having Luis Robert in center field. I just feel like his overall lack of consistency, which might be tied to a lot of injuries over the course of his career, makes him a really difficult player for me to project and to figure out. I mean, is it fair to assume that with health, Luis Robert could be a 600 plate appearance guy, even on a very competitive Mets team?
I don't know if he gets all the way to 6, but I think, they've said he's their everyday center fielder. Like, the idea is when he's healthy, he's going to be in center field. It would not surprise me if the Mets were a little more proactive in giving him rest days than they might be with, but a guy like Lindor, who plays 161 games a year, or Soto, who plays 160 last year. So I think, if Robert is fully healthy, he's probably playing 130 to 140 with time off in between. But they want him to claim that job and run with it and have it the full season. They've acquired a lot of center fielders under David Stearns. I think he's the fourth different one they've traded for. The others have not worked out to this point. They're hoping this one does as an everyday center fielder, because again, like if that move doesn't work out, if Robert has to miss time, they're kind of right back where they were last year, trying to find something that works with Tyrone Taylor. Do they move Carson Benji, prospect who probably profiles better in a corner long term? Do they try him out in center field? That's a big cascade of reactions if Robert doesn't hold his own as an everyday player there.
I think Benj is interesting because is there a chance he's an opening day option for them in right? I mean, like, what's the plan for that final outfield spot?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a chance. But they've said since the start of the offseason that he was going to have a chance in spring training to win a job on opening day. And the way they've navigated the offseason, they move Soto to left field, they trade Nimmo, they trade Jeff McNeil, they bring in Robert for center field. But so that right field job, they didn't really bring in anyone on a major league deal to take that job. So it's right now it's Benj, it's minor league signings like Mike Tauchman and MJ Melendez, it's Tyrone Taylor as a veteran there, it's Beatty if he ever gets into that mix, but that again has been slowed in spring training. So I think Benj is probably plan A. Even for opening day. I think it's like, it's almost certain that at some point this season, he's their everyday right fielder. It's just a matter of when. But they have left the door open for him to claim that on opening day. He's off to a decent start in spring. He's 4 for 13 at this point. 3 of those hits did come in one game. The other guys are also playing pretty well. Taylor Melendez had 2 homers. Tauchman hit a homer in his first at bat, and has been a pretty consistent offensive performer the last few years. So it might be that plan one. The second part of that plan in right field, if Bench doesn't work. But yeah, they want to keep that open for him.
Yeah, Tauchman to me would be, as part of a platoon, just a credible bottom of the order option for a contending team. It wouldn't be this spot that you necessarily expect to stay that way all year, because you could get to the trade deadline in July, find an upgrade then. You could have Benj or a different one of the guys in the mix as a prospect come through and look like they're ready at that point in the season. There's a lot of ways the season could kind of change, no matter how it starts at a spot like that. But it's a really good position player group, even if we have some questions about how the pieces fit defensively or how good they're going to be defensively at a couple of spots. I think they're good enough at the key spots where they're not going to be a liability to the pitching staff, right? Like, that to me seems like kind of the bar that you need to clear defensively to just be a contending team. And absolutely the Mets are clearing that right now. On the pitching side, another area where there has been a ton of overhaul, the reacquisition of Freddie Peralta for David Stearns, the only player he's traded for twice, was kind of the headliner for the rotation. I was just reading Ken Rosenthal's story about the fit. Freddie Peralta, very happy already in Mets camp and has a ton of family in New York, so it seems like it's kind of an ideal landing spot for him. Thinking about the rotation as a whole, like, Peralta is very important because he's been very healthy, hasn't dealt with arm issues for years. I think he kind of stabilizes the top of a group that has a lot of question marks, but all for different reasons. Like Nolan McLean, I'd just love to know like what you saw from him last year. Do you see a future ace? Do you see a future number one based on how his career started with the Mets a year ago?
Yeah, I mean, you look at those 8 starts, it's only 8 starts, right? And you don't want to extrapolate too much from 8 starts, but he checked off the boxes you want to see. Obviously, there was like the bottom line performance. He was good in those 8 starts, an ERA just over 2. He was good in the peripherals as well. The FIP was not that much higher. The strikeout rate was just around 30%. So if you're looking for like signs of a fluke there, you didn't really see it. He's got 6 different pitches. The movement on them it's explicit. Like you do not need to be someone to explain to you what makes Nolan McLean good. You watch him, you see the movement on his pitches. Like, yeah, that plays. So they're really excited about him already again in spring. They think he can be right there, kind of 1A to Peralta's number 1 at the start of the season. And when you look at this rotation as a whole, like you said, having Peralta as kind of a guy you can rely on to make 30 plus starts a year and give you, maybe not top level ace stuff, but close to it, one or two in most rotations, a credible opening day starter. That just makes the fit for the rest of the rotation look a lot better. It's a lot easier for Sean Manaea and Kodai Senga to be your big question marks of high variance performance over the last couple of years when they're not the guys you're also counting on to like start games 1 and 2 of a postseason series if you get there. David Peterson had a really nice first 4 months last year, struggled a lot the last 2 months. If he's your best starter the way he was for a lot of last year, that's probably a problem. Like you want him to be right there in the middle of the rotation. Clay Holmes had a nice first year as a starter, probably everything you could have hoped for. It just felt worse because he was their best starter for part of the season, their opening day starter last year. So again, too much put on his shoulders probably right away. So when you look at the whole group, that back end, like those back end guys being back end guys rather than the whole rotation being made of them, feels a lot better than it did last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way David Stearns has assembled this roster is it's like the Milwaukee concept with Steve Cohen's budget, right? Because you look at the way the position player group projects, and it's second only to the Dodgers in terms of position player war. You look at the way this group of pitchers projects, and it's closer to like a league average. It's actually projected very similar to the Brewers. And I don't think they're really worried about that internally because their pitching development has taken several steps forward. McLean is one of the many products of that. You got guys like Jonah Tong who probably throw some number of meaningful innings in this rotation because they're not all going to stay healthy. And there are some skills questions with the veterans as well. So I just think when you look at projections for the Mets and you're like, I don't know, is their pitching actually that good? My argument would be, yeah, it is because it's probably 8 or 9 deep in terms of starters they would actually trust during the regular season. And that's something Stearns always did really well during his time in Milwaukee. And I think it was something that was lacking just a little bit last year within this group.
Yeah, I mean, you saw when they had, their starting rotation through the middle of June was as good as any in baseball. I think had the best starters ERA. When, that pivot point for them in mid-June, when Senga goes down, Tyler McGill goes down, they were without Sean Manaea from the start of the season, without Frankie Montas, and he only made a couple of starts for them before going down again. When those injuries hit, they were not equipped to handle that. And I think talking to people with the Mets late last season, they pointed to, because we weren't equipped to handle that, then maybe we rushed Manaea back, we rushed Senga back, and then those guys were not, themselves in the second half of the season. Manaea both of them pitched to well over 5 ERAs. Senga gets set down at the end of the year, and you're trying to make a playoff push with 3 guys who just got called up from AAA the last month of the season. So I think they feel like they're in a better position. You mentioned Tong. Christian Scott is a guy who was their top pitching prospect going into 2024, had Tommy John surgery. He's back. Probably, number 7 or 8 in that order will start the year at AAA. A guy like Jack Wenninger is kind of a borderline top 100 prospect who's going to start the year in AAA. Another name that you'd expect to see at some point this season. So even after trading Brandon Sproat in that Freddie Peralta deal, they do feel like they're 9 or 10 deep with meaningful contributors this season in a way they weren't last year.
Within that group, you mentioned Senga before. You got that reset at AAA at the end of last year. How has he looked so far this spring? Do you think there's a good chance he gets back on track and looks more like the good, healthy version of Senga we've seen at times in the past?
I don't know. We've seen it the last 2 years. It's been so hard to predict with Kodai Senga. He's he's looked fine so far. He's said the right things, and he is generally pretty upfront when he's not feeling right with things. You go back to, again, the middle of June last year, this guy had one of the best ERAs in the National League, and he was saying, like, it just doesn't feel the way I want it to. And he knew at that time that the results were outpacing how he was actually pitching. And then it flipped entirely when he came back from the injury. He really didn't feel comfortable down the stretch of the season, why he accepted that trip to AAA at the end of the year. They think, again, they've got kind of the buffers around him to make it easier for him coming into the season. He's not expected to be the number one starter, doesn't have that burden on him. They don't need him to be an all-star the way he was in 2023 for them to be successful this season. But kind of whatever they get out of him could be icing on the cake to the rotation, because when he is good, this is a guy who can start a postseason game for you. This is a guy they believe so much in that when they brought him back in 2024 for the postseason, they started him in games even when he wasn't built out to do so. So that's how much they believed in him then, and they still think he can be that guy if he's healthy and mechanically sound.
Yeah, I mean, the results are actually really good. If you're a Mets fan and you've seen the bad, you might have kind of a skewed perception, but 285 career big league innings, a 3 ERA. It does come with a 125 whip. Usually you see a higher ERA next to a whip like that, so there's probably some park effects and some things that help him and work in his favor, but he's a good pitcher when it's working. 320 Ks in those 285 innings, too. Seemed a little undervalued from a fantasy perspective in the drafts I've seen so far this spring. The other starter I was going to ask you about those, Clay Holmes. It's year 2 of Holmes's transition back into working as a starter. And my concern with guys like that is always that they're going to run out of gas over the course of the season. I felt like that happened a little bit with Clay Holmes. I think maybe we also overestimated the impact of the kick change he was throwing last spring. Talked a lot about that on our show, and I thought that was going to unlock a better season from Holmes than what we got. And it certainly wasn't a bad year, but any expectations for Holmes to take a small step forward in year 2 of his move back to the rotation?
Yeah, you look at Holmes's year, and he got off to a really nice start, and then the strikeout rate really plummeted for him. And he was open about really needing to figure out how his mix would work as a starter. Most guys they're tinkering with 1 pitch going into a season, maybe 2. He had 3 new pitches going into 2025 in a new role, so a lot that he had to deal with. And I think he found what he wanted to be toward the end of the season when he wasn't physically all there. He found like he thought he got a little bit too far away from the sinker that had been his bread and butter pitch as a reliever. So he wanted to bring that back a little bit more. And if he's able to do that, he made all his starts last year. He's provided that nice innings base for himself going into this year. Was close to a league average starter for them last year. If he's able to kind of fine tune around the edges there, again, this is probably not a guy who's going to get Cy Young votes or make an all-star team as a starter, but can be a pretty good mid-rotation starter for them who, can make all the starts, be a nice cog in a rotation if he's able to figure that all out this year.
Yeah, I could definitely see that happening. Another guy, a deeper league fantasy player, I think, than somebody you want like in a 10-team league, because the Ks still might be a little less than what you're looking for in a shallow format. Moving over to the bullpen, Devin Williams comes over from the Yankees. Luke Weaver also comes over from the Yankees. I think we have a good sense of what the final 2 chairs in the bullpen look like. I mean, that's pretty easy to see. If something were to happen to Williams, do you think Weaver's the obvious next guy up to close? And then beyond those 2, how do you feel like the quality of this Mets bullpen stacks up against other contenders' bullpens as it's built right now?
Yeah, I think early in the season, it's definitely Weaver as the backup to Williams. When A.J. Minter comes back, which is probably the first half of May from the lat surgery he had last year, he's going to miss basically 12 months because of that. He's a guy who could work himself into potential 9th inning opportunities if Williams isn't available or is down. Minter, they really liked when they signed him ahead of last season that he had some closing experience. It could be that backup closer for them. They really thought that injury kind of derailed what their plans were for the bullpen going into the season. So they're excited to get him back eventually. And you've also got Brooks Raley as another lefty who came back from Tommy John last year and pitched in almost half their games after he came back, final 2 months of the year, and pitched really well. So, another guy they like late in games. And then it's kind of feeling out for roles. They signed Luis Garcia, who's been around the block as a middle reliever. They've got Craig Kimbrell in camp on a minor league invite, a guy who I think they would like to pitch well enough to make the team, to give them another kind of 6th, 7th inning option with the kind of stuff that Kimbrel has if he's able to locate it. Tobias Myers, who we didn't talk about much in the rotation conversation, is, if he's not a member of the rotation, part of the bullpen as an innings eater and maybe even as a guy who pitches his way into high leverage. It's not the kind of names you're used to for the Mets. It's probably a little shallower than you would like it to be if you're a contending team. But David Stearns has done a pretty good job over the course of his career turning some anonymous guys into valuable bullpen pieces. They've got, we talked about their pitching development. It's not just starters. They've got some relievers on the way. A guy like Dylan Ross, who was up the last couple games of last season, didn't pitch, but they like him. Jonathan Pintaro, who I think pitched in one game. Ryan Lambert, a guy who throws 100, comes right at you. They like him as a guy who could eventually play a role this season. So there's a lot of things to throw at the wall and see eventually what sticks for a team that's probably going to use 45 pitchers the way they did last year.
Yeah, and I think, but it'll probably be to better results. That would be my expectation, because I think they do have a better base to start from overall. But David Stearns had one of the busiest off seasons of any front office executive in baseball. You just look at the number of players that he moved, signed, let go. I mean, just incredible turnover from one year to the next. But I think if you were disappointed by what happened last year, I know Mets fans were, you couldn't run it back. You could not just say, oh yeah, let's just keep all the veterans we had. Let's just see if we can get a little better result with the team that underperformed a year ago. Potere has an 89.5 win total projection on these Mets. Tim, do you think that's too hot, too cold, or just right?
I think it sounds about right. The NL East is always going to be a bear. You've got Atlanta, you got Philly. The Marlins, I think, took a lot of people, including myself, by surprise last year. I didn't think that team would win 60 games. They almost won 80. Another teteam that's in the mix. Washington is still a couple of years away and probably further away than we thought going into last year. I think the thing about this Mets team that strikes me is it's a higher ceiling team than the one they built going into last year. And that's because you're replacing guys like Alonso and Nimmo and McNeil, guys who've been relatively consistent performers. They're going to be 2 to 3.5 win players for you pretty consistently, with guys like Bichette, Semien, Polanco, Robert, where they might be 5-win players. They might be half-win players. We've seen that from both sides in the last couple of years for a guy like Robert, and even Bichette with his 2024. So I think there is a bit more variance to that position player group, but I think the ceiling is higher on it. And if you're trying to catch a really, really good baseball team like the Los Angeles Dodgers, it probably behooves you to build the highest ceiling team you can. So I think that combined with what they've gotten at the top end of that starting pitching staff in Peralta and McClain as guys who, could be, really good top of the rotation starters for them, I think gives them that higher ceiling than maybe they had going into last year. But at the same time, if Bichette misses time, if Polanco misses time, if Semien's decline continues, if Robert's out, there's a lot of ways it can go wrong that are more obvious than I would have said this time last year. So in that sense, 89, 90, that's probably right around where I'd put them.
Yeah, just right seemed like where I was going to land on this one too. So I'm glad we agree on this. And the last question I'm going to ask you, just to look into the crystal ball, let's assume they're a playoff team this year. I think that's the in or out would be the projection I'd get it in. Who's the third starter in a longer playoff series? Like because if Freddie and McClain, let's assume everybody's healthy, who do you think they actually give the ball to for game 3 of a playoff series?
I think it's probably between Minaya and Senga, because if they're having a good season, one of those guys is probably good. So I think it's whichever one of those steps up. But I think they'd love it to be a tough decision between Minaya and Senga for the right reasons. They'd love it to be 2024 Minaya and 2023 Senga. And how do we choose? We've seen those guys pitch really well for the Mets in the recent past, but they got to do it again for the first time in a little while.
Yeah, hoping for better health for this group across the board. That'd be a great problem to have. And then who knows, maybe Jonah Tong has a better season than we're even expecting, and he ends up being in that conversation as well. Tim, we appreciate the time and the insight. Thanks for making some time to join the show today. We look forward to catch up with you again later on this season.
Oh, anytime. Thanks for having me.
We continue our team preview series with the Toronto Blue Jays, and to break down the Jays, we have our Blue Jays writer, Mitch Bannon. Mitch, thank you so much for making time to join me today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm on a little hiatus between my 2 spring stints, so it's the perfect timing to drop what I've learned and figure out what I still need to learn when I go back down.
Hey, this is perfect. I mean, I'm looking at this Jays team, and I am really hoping they've pushed the right buttons this offseason to make another run. I think as a neutral observer in the postseason especially, I really liked what they brought to the table. It felt like they were really one bad slider away from actually winning the World Series. Not to traumatize Jays fans by bringing that up. I'm sure Jays fans are thinking about that anyway. It was a fun offseason. I think a lot of fans wanted to see Bo Bichette come back. Of course, he's gone. He's with the Mets now. But they did bring in a really intriguing bat, Kazuma Okamoto, probably going to be a regular at third base. We keep starting these previews with a simple question. Who are the core 5 position players here? Because you can mix and match 4 spots, and usually catcher's one of them, even though Alejandro Kirk's going to play a lot for a starting catcher, so we don't really count him as part of their 5. But it's Vladdy, it's Springer when healthy, it's maybe Okamoto. Like, help me round out the bottom of that 5, because the Jays have a few options, and I think depending on how playing time shakes out, there could actually be some hidden fantasy value here.
Yeah, I think Dalton Varsho for sure in one of those. Like for fantasy people, if you're not playing in like an OBP league, Varsho like got to be a guy for you this year. I think you look at what he did last year with the power and the fact that he just like hasn't put together like a good season and a healthy season at the same time in so long, and he seems in a pretty good spot to do it. I would put him in there. Okamoto, I came into spring kind of wondering, okay, is this like a small side platoon third baseman who can also pinch in at first base and DH a little? It kind of sounds like the Jays are prepared to just give him third base and have him run with it. I think it's going to push Addison Barger in a right field on potentially a full-time basis. I think he's another kind of question mark there. But yeah, in terms of Okamoto, I think at the beginning of the season, he'll have to play himself out of being an everyday third baseman is kind of how I understand it. The Jays are much higher on the defense than most teams. The bat, I don't think was like much of a question for many teams interested in signing him. I think they think he's going to hit. He's proven more than most of these Japanese guys he can catch up to velocity. And so I think we're going to get a good taste of him at the WBC. And if he kind of can keep up with big league fastballs there, I think the Jays are going to be off and running with him at third base. Barger is kind of like the question of where does he land on kind of like Jesus Sanchez, Andres Jimenez, like maybe they're a bit more platoony. Maybe Ernie Clement sides over to shortstop. Jesus Sanchez, I'd be like shocked if he starts more than like 10 games against lefties this year. Something would have had to go really, really wrong for the Blue Jays. But Barger's the guy who has a chance to play like 150 games if he's healthy. I think you look at his regular season last year, the Jays were pretty hesitant to start him against lefties. You go to the playoffs, he was in there pretty often. They pinch hit him knowing Anthony Banda was going to come into a World Series game, and he hit a pinch hit grand slam off of Banda. Like, if that's not John Schneider having confidence against a pretty good bullpen lefty for Barger, I don't know what is. And I think he's like Okamoto. He's going to be given a chance to kind of, especially with Anthony Santander out for the first 6 months, Barger's going to be given the keys to right field, and he'll have to play his way out of seeing lefties to start the season.
Yeah, that Santander injury was kind of a big deal for unlocking that possibility for Barger. I felt like in a world where Santander was healthy, it was just one too many bats until someone landed on the IL with a smaller injury potentially. But I think you're right to look back at what was happening in the postseason as a better indicator of intent and opportunity and trust in a player. You have somebody that's in a difficult spot in the most important games of your season. You probably trust them to have a role like that at the beginning of the next regular season. Completely agree on the Jesus Sanchez read. He's a big side platoon outfielder. Probably a nice little pickup for them, though, because it didn't go well for him in Houston, but he was quietly putting together a nice season again in Miami before that midseason trade. So I think they're going to end up being pretty happy with that in a late addition. And even if it's only 450 plate appearances, it's probably ideal usage. Jimenez, I think, is a little bit interesting just because the Jays sought him out. You know, they made that trade with the Guardians. They bring him in, I think, with the expectation that they could maybe get something back to the peak we saw from Jimenez a few years ago, where he was like a down ballot MVP candidate in Cleveland. And injuries last year kept that from happening. But Andres Giménez looked good in the postseason too, so I'm just kind of curious what your read is on him. Does he have a shot to crack that core five? I mean, his defense at shortstop is going to be important, but they have a very capable second baseman that can slide over in Ernie Clement. So what are your expectations for Andres Giménez as a guy that's shown us a lot, has had trouble staying healthy, and hasn't quite been able to repeat that level we saw at his peak?
Yeah, I think you kind of have to answer the question of Giménez is here in two parts. One is like he is the shortstop now, which is a little different. He kind of played second baseman like a shortstop anyways. Like he was rangy, he was getting to a lot of balls. You kind of build the infield defense around him, but you expect it to take a little bit more of a toll on him. I wouldn't be shocked if Clement sees some time against lefties just to give him a breather there at shortstop. But in terms of the offensive potential, I think the Jays are still all in on kind of recapturing some of that. I think the question is, like, what is the ceiling now? I think he put up like 140 WRC plus a couple years ago. Like that would be adding like legitimately almost 80 points from what he produced last year. It would be a pretty incredible jump. I think if they get him back to like a league average or slightly better hitter, they'll be very happy with Giménez. But in talking to him, I think the one thing that's kind of slid under the radar is that health. I think he was pretty good in the playoffs, but I talked to him in spring and he's like, my ankle was still hurt in the playoffs. Like I could play on it, but I couldn't run at 100% and it was impacting me at the field and the plate. He said he didn't feel 100% until like December, closer to January. Like it really took a toll and he was battling through it. So I think like there is a sample size of a couple years now of Andres' offense declining. You can't overlook that, but I'm more willing to throw out like the really tough offensive season he had last year and give him a shot this year. I think if he gets back to league average hitting, there was only like 8 shortstops last year who were 5 outs above average or better and a league average hitter. I think he's got a chance to at least make that 9 if he can get to average. I don't know for fantasy people, for people like outside of the Blue Jays, if Andres Giménez is going to be a world beater. But the Jays and David Hopkins, the hitting coach, have some faith that they can get some more juice out of Andres.
I think part of it too, with an ankle injury, I mean, like, explains why the stolen bases were not there last year. He was still 12 for 14. He was very efficient, but this is a guy that went back to back with 30 steal seasons in 23 and 24. I think that facet of his game is more reliable than what we saw power-wise a few seasons ago. And he was a 6-win player in 2022 with Cleveland. But if he's a 3 or 4-win shortstop for the Jays, that's a massive, exceeded expectation sort of outcome that doesn't actually seem that unreasonable to me. So I would just kind of look at Andres Giménez as maybe an underrated player where health has really kind of steered us away from higher expectations that we had for him a few years ago. And he's still like 27. Like it feels like he's been around forever. So he's still at that age where he could still unlock something else. Let's shift the focus over to the pitching. They splashed the big contract for Dylan Cease, 7 years, $210 million. They have a lot of starting pitching depth. Cody Ponce was brought into after a really nice run in the KBO. They bring back Max Scherzer. Clearly, there's a series of plans in place to get through the regular season. And you have young guys like Trey Savage who need to be managed a certain way to have innings left at the end of the season. You have older guys like Scherzer. Walk me through the plan. How are they going to manage this? Are they going to use a 6-man rotation for stretches? Are we going to see more Barrios and Eric Lauer than people are expecting? How do you see the shape of the season working for this starting pitching unit?
I would be surprised if we saw a 6-man for any extended stretch. That was kind of, as for everything that went right for the Jays last year, their brief little post-trade deadline, post-Shane Bieber acquisition, 6-man rotation in August and September was like one of the hardest stretches of the season for them. I don't think it really worked for anybody in the rotation. It didn't work for the team. They lost a decent amount of games in that run. So I think they're kind of fearful to go back to that with so many of these kind of established veterans who love a good routine. They love being in a 5-man rotation. So I think what John Schneider said to the media down in Florida when they officially or unofficially signed Scherzer is that it's going to be like a meritocracy. They're going to go with the best 5 starters at any single time. Now, I don't expect it to be completely the best 5 starters at any time because they also have to manage workloads. Like if it was the best 5 starters Trey Savage might be making 33 starts and pitching 190 innings. And I can tell you the Jays are not going to do that this year. They've already said he hasn't even pitched in a game in spring training yet. They're taking him very slow. I wouldn't be shocked if we saw 3 or 4 inning starts with a piggyback to start the season for him. If you're looking for quality starts from Trey Savage this year, I don't think you're going to get many of them. I'd just be shocked if he's pitching that deep into games. But for the rest, I think the Jays are, as ironic as it might be, kind of taking a bit of a page from the Dodgers. They're looking at how has this franchise been able to combat going so deep in the playoffs over and over and over and really riding these arms over and over and over. And how you do it is you have like 8 or 9 guys and you use the injured list less than judiciously. You have guys ready for when it matters. I think the second someone like has a little tweak in their shoulder that maybe for some teams they would have to pitch through just because they need him on the mound and the guy can pitch, the Jays are going to be, okay, next man up. It's Eric Lauer's month in the rotation, or Max Scherzer, you're definitely in now. I think it's going to be a lot of that. It's hard to look at who is going to be the constants because I think so much of that is just going to be dictated by success and injuries at the beginning of the season. I'd expect Dylan Cease to be like the one constant in this rotation. It's been a constant kind of his entire career, and he doesn't go deep into games, but he can make 33 starts and give you 160 innings and be pretty good. And also, he didn't pitch deep in the playoffs last year like a lot of these other guys, so I expect him to be the guy. Cody Ponce is interesting. Like he looked really good in like the stuff is translated. Like his velo is still up from when he was in Korea. His breaking balls and his changeup still spinning and moving in a way that you would kind of be a little hesitant with the new ball in MLB, but it seems like it's all there. And I think he's a guy who, coming off a big season last year in Korea, could be another constant in the rotation. Like they're not going to have to worry about him coming off 220 innings like Kevin Gausman. He doesn't have that many miles on his arm, so I think he has the upside to be kind of that second constant. You would think Gausman would be as well, but like the dude is old. The dude pitched more innings than basically any pitcher in baseball last year. He pitched on the second last day of the season. I think the Jays are going to be pretty cautious with him as well. So it's, for people trying to parse the Blue Jays rotation, it's going to be an ongoing thing. Every 10 days, you can probably have me back on and be like, okay, who are the 5 guys in the rotation? And it's probably going to be a different 5 guys.
Yeah, I mean, having 8 or 9 starters you trust, at least in the regular season, is huge because you want to make sure you've got at least 3 or 4 you still really trust that are healthy with innings and enough in the tank come playoff time. And that's clearly where the focus has been with the various moves that they've made. The bullpen, I think, is still very solid. I expected more from Jeff Hoffman throughout last season. Obviously, the pitch he threw to Miguel Rojas in the World Series was just a missed opportunity, poor execution, right? And bouncing back from that seems tough. Like, it was a generally disappointing year anyway, and then that was like an exclamation point on it. What are your expectations for Hoffman in year 2? Can he bounce back? Because I think he's a guy that has elite closer stuff. We just didn't see that level of consistency from him a year ago.
Yeah, he had such a bizarre year. Like, even the regular season, the home runs were like such a huge problem. He had a couple big blown saves that really plagued his entire season. There's also like 6-week stretches where he was rocking like a 1.5 ERA and was striking out the world, and the home runs weren't a problem. And then every so often you'd run into one of those outings. You go to the playoffs, he was basically untouchable for like most of the playoffs. He comes in Game 7 of the World Series, and it's like, oh, there's like, dang. The Jays were really hoping they could get by the entire playoffs without one of those Jeff Hoffman blow-up home runs, and kind of a bad time to have it happen. I think Jeff would say that as well. But in terms of like projecting forward, he's the type of guy, the type of profile that, like, even if I wasn't like diving in, talking to him, understanding what he's doing, just from afar, looking at like the stats on the sheet, it's like, this is a guy a lot of people would project to bounce back, because so much of his issue was the fact that his fastball velocity declined as he got used so much during the season. The Jays have brought in other relievers to help ease that burden, and it was the home runs. And he rocked an insanely high home run per fly ball rate. It was a lot of like the Rojas ones where it's like one misexecuted pitch. How much of that is because of the usage? You cut like 5 or 6 home runs out of his season, And he is, I think, like one of the top closers like the Jays expected him to be, because the walks were pretty low, the strikeouts were really high. It's just keeping the ball in the ballpark. And if he can do that, I agree. I think he could go wire to wire as the Blue Jays closer again. And if not, I don't know if there's like necessarily a dude in this bullpen who's immediately ready to step up. Louis Varland certainly has the stuff, but he's run into kind of similar issues to Hoffman in the past, where he just gives up home runs as well. So if you're going to zag, I would expect that if you tell me Jeff Hoffman is not the closer on like September 1st for this team, I'm betting it's because they've gone out and got someone at the deadline.
Traded for someone, yeah, more of the same maybe from Hoffman, where the homers are still a little bit of a problem and they decide they want to upgrade that spot. I think the way they used Varland in the playoffs, though, does give you the idea that they're confident in him in tough spots. It felt like when there were higher leverage spots anywhere, the heart of the order was up. They needed Ks. Like Varland was that guy that John Schneider would trust. So there could be a world in which he's a closer, maybe not in 2026, but somewhere down the road. They did bring in Tyler Rogers, as you mentioned, gives them some funk out of that bullpen, a guy that you could throw out there almost every other day, just based on how he's been used throughout his career. So I think he's going to be an important addition, even if we're not necessarily looking at him for saves. But as a unit, still looks like a good bullpen, and one that they'll continue to try and improve, because they're clearly, pedal to the floor, trying to win that championship this year and try to run it all the way back. We've been asking everybody about the PECOTA win total projections. 88.6 for the Jays, pretty big number. AL East is tough. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Or is it just right for these Jays?
I think it's just right, because like I know a lot of Jays fans see this as like a 90-win team. I'm sure the Jays internal projections see this as a 90-win team, but there are like some potential pitfalls. Like we talk about how deep that rotation is, but like it's deep because there's a lot of dudes who pitched a lot of innings and a lot of old dudes in that bullpen. You lose a couple of those guys, and that next level of depth, kind of after Eric Lauer, thins out pretty quick. The Jays don't have like a lot of established young AAA arms. A lot of their kind of interesting prospects are back-end rotation pieces currently trying to climb up from AA. So it's going to be a while before we see them. And also, like, this offense has gotten worse on paper. Like, Okamoto has come in, Jesus Sanchez has come in, but they lost Bo Bichette, and there's a lot of dudes coming off pretty spectacular seasons. George Springer got MVP 7, I believe he was last year. After like this time last year, we were talking about, okay, like, are they going to eat the money? Are they going to release him? What do they do? Addison Barger, as we talked about, took a huge step. Does he take another step, or does the league kind of adapt back to him? Alejandro Kirk was healthy and logged a bunch of innings behind the plate last year. Like Tyler Heineman, sneaky, had like a crazy season. He was like a top 10 most valuable catcher last year. It's the Blue Jays like sporadically used backup. Like you can't pencil that in again for 2026. The offense has on paper gotten worse, and the division, as you said, has gotten a lot better. So I think kind of that 88 win mark, 87, 88 is a good midpoint that kind of captures the fact that some things could go wrong for this team, or they could be a 93 to 94 win team again.
Yeah, I mean, the way it breaks down just for the whole division by the same system, 88.6 is the number as of this morning. I guess it was 88.5 when I looked it up last time. 87.8 for the Yankees, like two teams kind of in their top two tier. Not a surprise given how last season went. A little bit of a dip before you get to the Orioles at 83.1, the Red Sox at 82.9, and the Rays at 81.8. Even that Rays projection, that actually seems like a little high relative to the overall strength of the roster, but then you think about the way they tend to perform, and you're like, okay, I could see them being a little better than 500, and we know that when they catch some lightning in a bottle, they're good enough to find a way to win this division too. So I always feel like I'm higher on the teams that get projected for the last 3 spots in the East than I am for the ones that get projected for the top 2, no matter who those teams are, just because of the constant battling that happens here, and the possibility of 4 playoff caliber teams, maybe arguably 5, depending on how you feel about Tampa Bay, all being there when the season begins.
Yeah, it's going to be who's healthiest. Like, I know that's such a lame take, and everyone says that every single year, but it's like The Yankees, it's like, okay, how do Rodon and Cole come back from their injuries? Does their pitching hold up in the meantime? Does Judge stay healthy? Like that. And it's the same for the Jays. There is a mix of like, okay, can the Jays like do it again? Like, are these guys going to come off the World Series and like have the magic again this year? I don't think it really matters if George Springer is healthy. If he's on the field, he's going to play. I think we saw that last year. But everyone else on the roster, the pitching especially, it's are they healthy? And that's the error bars probably for every single team except for Tampa Bay, where it doesn't really, they're kind of banking on all their pitchers getting hurt, and they'll figure it out either way.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to look at it. But yeah, the way the Jays have built this roster, they've got a little more insurance than a lot of other teams do. They can withstand some injuries, like more than a lot of other teams, I think is the way I would look at it. But really curious to see how it all comes together for them. Mitch, we appreciate your time and your insight. We look forward to catching up with you again later on this season.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Thanks for having me on.
All right, we continue our team preview series with the Cleveland Guardians, and to break down what was one of the most underwhelming off seasons for any team in the league this year, we bring in our Guardians beat writer, Zack Meisel. Zack, thank you so much for joining me. What happened this winter in Cleveland? If we had recorded this a week ago, we wouldn't even have known that Rhys Hoskins was part of their 2026 plans. Like, how do you have an offense that puts up an 87 WRC plus a year ago and decide we're okay. We're just going to add one veteran power bat and we're just going to run it back with this core?
Let's see. They signed Jose Ramírez to an extension. They added Rhys Hoskins to a very low risk deal. They signed a couple relievers, and that's it. So thanks for having me, DVR. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, you know, they're never going to win an offseason, right? They're never going to. It's if you didn't know their record or how their season ended, a lot of times you would just look at their moves in the offseason and think, oh, it must be a rebuilding team that's just going to rely on some young kids coming up. That's what they're doing. It's just that they've won the Division 3 of the last 4 years, so it makes you scratch your head for sure.
Yeah, I think in the face of the Tigers spending money on Framber Valdez, upgrading their bullpen a little bit, just doing things that a team that spends more within the division will do in years where they're being more aggressive, it stands out. But the results do just jump off the page. And I think the first question I have for you is, every team has to rely on 5 regulars at some point because you can only platoon and mix and match at 4 spots. And I have a really hard time figuring out who those 5 players are. Obviously, Jose Ramírez and Steven Kwan are the first 2. Hoskins, who we kind of mentioned up top, could be the 3rd, maybe. But who else is actually in their core everyday group? And are we maybe overlooking some of the prospects having bigger roles than anticipated? Because by projection, Chase DeLauter would already be in that group as someone that should be playing nearly every day.
Yeah, there's like a big if or but with just about everybody outside of Jose Ramírez and maybe Steven Kwan. You know, Kyle Manzardo, they would love for him to join that group, but there are questions on how well he can hit left-handed pitching. Rhys Hoskins, they would love for him to join that group, but there are questions about what he's got left in the tank. And then you look to some of the young guys that they're banking on. And Chase DeLauter, I have no doubt that if he played 150 games, he'd be a Rookie of the Year finalist. But can he stay healthy? He's never done that. In the minors, he struggled to stay healthy in college. So that's one spot where it's like, okay, there's a wide variance here, right? This guy could be Rookie of the Year. He could be on the shelf for 5 or 6 months. George Valera, kind of a similar case, was a top 50 prospect at one time. Still relatively young. He looked good for a month last season when he was called up. He was hitting second for them against right-handed pitching, but he has historically struggled against lefties. He's struggled to stay healthy. He could play a corner, but also might be better suited for DH. So there's hurdles here with a lot of options. Travis Bazzana, the number 1 pick from a couple years ago, could come up at some point and lock down second base. At catcher, probably looking at a Bo Naylor, David Fry, Austin Hedges timeshare. So you're right, DVR. It's if this team could have a 30-man roster and you could toss 17 position players on there, they could probably figure this out and it might work. But the pieces don't fit, and they don't fit when you're limited to 13 of them.
Yeah, I think they'd love to have 4 more league minimum pre-arb guys on this roster if you let them have that. Is there anybody in the group of holdovers, guys like Brian Rocchio, Gabriel Arias, that you could just see maybe taking a step forward? Because it's easy for us to take guys who are former prospects, they've got a year or two of service time, they haven't necessarily hit like everyday players yet. Like, sometimes it just takes time, and they do have the luxury of maybe getting one more look before some of those prospects start to push harder for their spots. So has anyone stood out to you in camp on the position player group side?
Bo Naylor's interesting to me because his walk and strikeout rates trended in a much better direction last season, like made substantial improvements. And yet his final slash line looked pretty similar to what it was the year before. I feel like there's 20 home run power in there. And if you can get 20 home runs with a 10 to 12% walk rate and your strikeout rate's not, unbearable, like if you have good defense behind the plate, that's a pretty valuable catcher. So he's one that I'm keeping an eye on. But, with a lot of those guys, I'm clinging on to things. It's like Gabriel Arias has been the same hitter for 3.5 years, and it's a profile that's hard to change. You can't really overhaul it if you can't make contact at a high enough clip, and your swing decisions are not great, and it's hard to do. So Naylor's the one that maybe stands out. Rocchio, just because he can draw some walks and he's a switch hitter, like maybe there's more in there. I just don't know how much more, because he's not a guy who hits the ball hard a ton. He's not going to hit for much power. So they could use a breakout from Bo Naylor. And then otherwise, it's, they are leaning on, whether it's DeLauder, Valera, Bazana. I mean, those are 3 blue chip prospects at least, or they were at one point in time. So it's not like they're, it's believable that the offense can be better. It doesn't necessarily excuse the inactivity over the winter, but like you can see some of the vision here. It's just, again, there's just like a ton of risk across the board, and you can't just rely on those young kids we haven't seen much yet. You do need, whether it is Naylor or Rocchio, someone in that group is going to have to step forward for this offense to even be, 20th in baseball, I think.
Yeah, that almost seems like a great outcome for them. If they nudge their way up to the top of the bottom third of the league's offenses, then it just comes back to, is run prevention good enough, right? Do we play good enough defense in the places and find enough pitching to make the pieces actually come together? And the pitching just doesn't pop for me the way it has in years past either, though. That's the weird part about it. I mean, Tanner Bivey's coming off of a down year. I think we do have to give him a lot of credit for Slade Ciccone. Like, I think there were people that kind of wondered, like, hey, what are they doing here? Like, he didn't really show a lot during his brief time in Arizona, but he looked pretty good last year. Gavin Williams, I think it was kind of an up and down season. Like the overall result was good, but I feel like he took a strange route to get there. So when you look at the top 3 in this rotation compared to top 3s that Cleveland has put out there over the course of the past decade, does it also seem like it's fallen a little bit on the pitching side as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because it was, then in 2024, they essentially went wire to wire in the AL Central. And you normally think about a Cleveland team doing that, and you're saying, okay, probably the starting pitching was going 6-7 innings every night, and it was just a well-oiled machine, and that couldn't have been further from the truth. They had Ben Lively was like anchoring that rotation alongside Tanner Bibee. They had Carlos Carrasco made 21 starts that season. It was a mess. And then last season, for a few months, it was similar. It was really rough. And then they moved to a 6-man rotation for about the last month, and all 6 guys were thriving. I mean, it was Tanner Bibee had a 1.30 ERA in September. Joey Cantillo emerged as a real threat, and Parker Messick came up from AAA and looked great. So I think for this rotation to be as functional as they need it to be, Gavin Williams he's got ace stuff, right? They've been waiting on this for a couple years, and I think he finally, there was a stretch for about 6 weeks, 8 weeks maybe last season where it was just trying to strike out everybody. And he'd get ahead in the count, and then he would just try to get guys to chase. And then he had to find the right pitch mix, and he had some delivery stuff to clean up. And then the last few months, like the walk rate improved. The strikeout rate was still healthy, but it was just, I can't tell you how many outings he had early in the season where it's like he went 4 1/3 and he struck out 8, but he walked 4 and he threw 110 pitches. And it's just, you're sitting there watching those games and it's like, it's a slog. It's like you feel exhausted watching it. He cleaned that up. And if he can maintain that, maybe take another step forward, I think the thing to remember about this group is they're all in that stage of the career where they're young enough to still have development, but they have big league experience. You have things you can draw on. Like Joey Cantillo went through a lot last season, and by the end of the year, he realized, okay, no one he was like one of the lowest chase rates in the league among starting pitchers. So he realized, all right, if I throw stuff out of the zone, guys aren't going to swing at it. So let me just fill up the zone more. I've got a changeup with a 49% whiff rate. I've got a good curveball. I've got elite extension, so 92 looks like 97, and it's just, you see these guys learning and growing from it. They need more of that. So you're right. On the surface, you look at this rotation, and if you're not in Cleveland, if you didn't watch these guys late last season, you're probably like, okay, it looks pretty average, maybe at best. But there's a lot of, again, and this is the case for the entire team, it's some of these guys are going to pop. Joey Cantillo, he's one of Eno's darlings, I know, with the Stuff Plus figures. And there is a path for him to emerge as a really good starter this year. Doesn't guarantee anything. It also could be a flop. And I think that there's a wide spectrum of potential outcomes for most of these guys.
Either they're going to go with the 6-man rotation again for at least stretches this year, if not all year, or that was just a late season, guys are running out of gas sort of adjustment that they made?
No, just September. They only have 6 starters. They don't have depth behind that. I think that's another issue with this rotation is like once they get to maybe August, there's some interesting prospects who could be part of this, but they really don't have much. So they've got to keep somebody at AAA when they inevitably need a 6th starter. And, it's early in the season. It handicaps your bullpen if you're going with 6 starters, 7 relievers. So they're going to stick with 5.
Considering what happened with Emmanuel Clase and Luis Ortiz and when it happened last year, the revival of the Guardians down the stretch was shocking. I mean, like you just figure like with the starting point of where they were when that news broke and the roster they had, like the thought of Cleveland being a playoff team last year around the All-Star break just seemed absolutely absurd, which probably says a lot about the coaching staff and Stephen Vogt and the work they do. I guess that's the other part of this team that obviously has something working well. There's still something working on the coaching staff. There's still something working in player development, and there's still something there that enables them to exceed projections more often than not. And even the Pythagorean win total for the Guardians, well below the actual win total. And I don't think you care. If you keep outpacing that, you're like, fine, like we've got something that works. Like, what do you think it is about this group of coaches right now that is enabling them to exceed expectations? What are we missing outside of Cleveland when we look at this team?
You don't want to live on that edge forever, right? Like it's not foolproof. Like they're going to run into a season where it just doesn't work because it's hard. It's I remember asking Stephen Vogt at the winter meetings in December, and I said, like, what do you have to do, jokingly, like, what do you have to do to win a 3rd straight Manager of the Year award? And he laughed, and he's like, we probably have to win 120 games. And it's like, well, no, because the projections aren't going to like you again. You might not have to go above and beyond like that. But I do think they have really good coaches. I mean, Carl Willis he's overseen 5 Cy Young winners, and they're not the most obvious names. Rick Porcello. Shane Bieber was not a top prospect. Cliff Lee back in the day. So I think he's really good, and also just they have. It seems simple, but then you get to know other organizations and you realize that this isn't prevalent, but it's just being adaptable. Like Carl Willis is in his 60s, and he could be the old curmudgeonly guy going like, well, like this is how we did it back in my day, and that guy, people call him the walking track man. Like you would not expect someone in their mid-60s who's accomplished everything there is to accomplish as a pitching coach would embrace new technology and data and things like that. But they have a really good way of I think delivering ideas to players, partnering with them, and like the teaching style. I remember Carl telling me this, where he might know in his head what the delivery tweak or the pitch usage tweak is to get a pitcher to take that next step. But if he just tells you, like, hey, do this, like you're going to be like, okay, fine. But if he can lead you there, and maybe you struggle a little bit and then you unearth it, if the pitcher thinks that they're the ones who like unlocked it and they can see the path to making that change, it's going to be so much more effective. It's honestly, it's like parenting, right? Like I've got 2 little kids, and if I just tell them to clean up their room, they're going to roll their eyes and they're not going to want to do it, and it's going to turn into a tantrum, right? But if I can show them why cleaning their room will make their lives easier or my life easier, I mean, my kids are 3 and 1, like they're still not going to do it. But just go with me with the metaphor here. Like it's more effective that way, right? And I think they just have a knack, and this is a culture top down where you get buy-in. I mean, I can't tell you, like the Guardians they added like 100 relievers this offseason, and I've talked to Connor Brogdon and Colin Holderman and maybe Cody Hoyer. Every single one, it's like, why did you come to Cleveland? Well, I heard about, the pitching factory and the way that they help pitchers squeeze the most out of what they have to offer. So they just have, and that's just with the pitching side. They've struggled developing hitters. The hope is that this next batch with DeLauder and Bazzana and guys like that, they're able to flip the narrative on that. I just think they've got a good culture here. You see it in Milwaukee. You see it in Tampa. These teams that maybe don't invest in major league payroll, but they're investing in coaches and coordinators and player development. And, it's all those teams have people poached from them every offseason, and yet they're still functioning. And it's because you've established an identity and a culture that it just works.
Yeah, I think there's a few underlying trends there. It sounds like Carl Willis is what I would describe as maybe a lifelong learner. Like he's not going to sit back and say, I figured it out. And the game changes, and then it changes again, and it changes some more. And if you're adapting to that, people see that success over more than a decade. Like, I mean, you listed off those Cy Young pictures. Porcello's Cy Young is like, 10 years in the rearview mirror already? Like, to continue having that success is something, right? I think of like Ray Searage several years ago in Pittsburgh. Kind of feels like maybe he was a little bit less adaptable, and now Ray Searage is long gone, right? So I do think that's a big part of how some of the most successful coaches and organizations stick around. It's continuing to push the envelope, saying this was working, but what's going to work next? How do we continue to adapt? And the buy-in that you mentioned, yeah, that's huge. I think it's easier to get that buy-in with a roster of less experienced players than it is to be, like if you were kind of like a mid-level team. This is where I feel like maybe stuff goes wrong for the Angels. You throw money at veterans, you spend on major league payroll, maybe you don't spend as much on your coaching staff, or you have a smaller staff. You kind of miss the mark because you have guys that have been in the league longer. You're paying them a lot more money. They have bigger ideas of to like what works for them and what doesn't. So I think maybe some of this is also just ideally lining up players that are in the big leagues for the first or second time, realizing that if they don't change, their time in the big leagues will come to an end quickly too. I think that also gets that kind of curiosity going in a place where you absolutely have to have buy-in.
Yeah, it's, they've made mistakes, right? Like Junior Caminero gives them nightmares. They flipped him for Tobias Myers, and then Tobias Myers broke out in Milwaukee, and it was like they lost that trade twice. They've had free agent signings that haven't gone their way either. You know, they've Josh Bell didn't work out, Mike Zunino didn't work out. So there's constant learning and growth, and they're not an infallible organization by any means, but you know, I think that they've tried to learn. I just keep thinking about the hitting development side, and you know, they have the pitching thing down so well, and they have for a long time, and they've asked themselves, like, how can we mirror that on the hitting side? What are we doing wrong? And the problem in baseball is sometimes you don't know for years and years. You know, you think you've got it all figured out, but you don't know until these guys get to the big leagues, and you have to give them opportunities. We were talking about Naylor and Rocchio possibly breaking out in year 3 or year 4, and it's like sometimes it takes that long, right? So sometimes the answer is, nope, we were wrong about this, but you just spent the last 5-6 years overhauling how you do things, and you know, in some places that costs you your job. In Cleveland, they've had Chris Antonetti and Mike Chernoff in place for 20 plus years, and for the most part, they've done a lot of things well. And you know, I think when you can establish that culture and stability, and people don't feel like they're going to get fired if they try something innovative and it backfires, I think that can help too.
I think that's a great point. Like, if you know you have some runway, you can take a few more risks, and maybe that's exactly what you have to do when you're playing with a much, much smaller major league payroll. Circling back to the bullpen real quick, Cade Smith looked phenomenal in the closer role. Looks like an elite closer from a fantasy perspective. I think the question a lot of people that listen to the show would have about the bullpen is twofold. One, as a unit, is it still elite? Does it mask some of the depth concerns we might have about the rotation? And two, if something were to happen, if Cade Smith needed a stint on the IL at some point this year, who's actually the next option up? Is there a clear fallback option to take over the ninth inning in a potential Smith absence?
Yeah, so I think Sean Armstrong's the answer there. He had an awesome year last year, and you know, it's crazy. 10 years ago, he was traded, midseason trade to Milwaukee in the Jonathan Lucroy deal, and then Lucroy woke up the next morning and said, actually, I'm going to veto this. I don't want to go to Cleveland. They went to the World Series. He did not, but so Armstrong stayed in the organization and eventually bounced around the league, and now he's back. So it's kind of a weird full circle moment. The bullpen's interesting. I have some questions about some guys in middle relief. I don't know that it's like a dominant unit, but I think there's some sleepers here. I think Colin Holderman he was a really good setup guy for Pittsburgh, had one down year, and now he's trying to get back on track. Cody Hoyer, guy who had elite stuff and was thought really highly of a few years back, but hasn't been able to stay healthy. And then for later in the year, Franco Aleman is a guy who throws really hard. Had a rough year at AAA last year, but he's been in big league camp for a couple years in spring training, and they're waiting for him to break into the big leagues and potentially be a high leverage guy. Andrew Walters is thought of as a closer in waiting and missed all of last year with injury, so he's going to be a little bit behind, but the stuff is there. So later in the season, he could be another high leverage option. Don't forget about Daniel Espino. First round pick, top prospect, looked like an ace, and then had 2 shoulder surgeries. He's healthy now. He made his spring training debut and only needed 9 pitches, so I wish we got to see more, but he hit 98. And so, you know, the slider's still really good. He could be an option for later in the season. So there's a good safety net there. You know, I think early on you've got like your Matt Festas and your Connor Brogdons, your Tim Herrons, and then later in the year, if you want to get crazy, there's some guys with really good stuff who just don't have experience or have had injuries who I think could really elevate this into an elite group.
Espino just being healthy again and getting through a full season would be a great story. I'd love to see that. I think he would be an impact arm if it comes together like that. You know, as we're talking here, I think the biggest takeaway for me is really that they need to stay healthy in that rotation group. Like, even if they're going to send Messick down to start the year because the other 5 guys ahead of him are all healthy, Cantillo doesn't have options, so that would probably like make his spot a little more safe if you're kind of worrying with the depth chart. They can't take on major injuries in that rotation. That's where things could unravel on this team really quickly. The win total projection is underwhelming as you'd expect. Dakota has a 75.2 on there. I've asked everybody this question. We get a lot of too colds because I think we like to be optimistic this time of year. Is that too hot, too cold, or just right for the 26 Guardians?
It's too cold. I think that's probably the low range of potential outcomes here. There's going to be a lot of turnover on this roster as the season goes on. And as we talk, it's like, how many guys do we name where there's boom or bust potential? And we just don't know because they don't have experience. And so there's a path to 75 and 87. There's definitely a path to 87 and 75. I have no idea. Anyone can have me on for analysis of this team. I've got none. It's a team full of guys with 2 years of experience or no experience. And, because of that, there's such wide swings that are possible. So I would take the over on that. But you could convince me of a lot of different outcomes for this team, and I would believe you.
Yeah, I find these smaller market teams that generally don't project well to be more likely to exceed expectations than to fall completely flat and end up below them. Like if you said just right, I could probably okay, yeah, just right, fine. But if you said no, too hot, they're a 68 win team, no, they're gonna find a way to be better than you'd think. And young players that they're going to rely on might not be projected for as much time as they're actually going to get to. That's the other kind of takeaway I have about the Guardians as they're currently built and projected. Zach, I appreciate your time and your insight. And if you do figure out how to get your kids to clean their room, I have a 3-year-old. We're still working on cleaning up. Please pass along any notes you have because I need that help.
Don't anticipate any luck in that department, but I'll let you know.
Yeah, same. I'll report back if I come up with something. Zack Meisel covers the Guardians here at The Athletic. That is going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. Thanks to Zack. Thanks to Tim Britton. Thanks to Mitch Bannon for joining me on today's show. We are back with you on Tuesday.